Well, hi again, and thanks for popping by. In this lesson, we're going to focus in on the lymphatic system. Now, the lymphatic system is a parallel circulatory system that you may not have given a lot of consideration to, but it's quite important. So, I want to sort of predicate its importance by explaining its roles. The first role that comes to mind is that the lymphatic system returns excessive tissue fluid and puts it back into the circulatory system. After all, if you have excess fluid, it should be processed by the kidneys and eliminated by the body. But first, you have to get it out of the tissues. Now, second, as you're eliminating fluid from the tissues, you have to realize that that fluid could be infected. There could be things in there, different pathogens like viruses or bacteria. And it's also possible that cancer cells could be floating through that fluid in a process, hopefully, that doesn't occur. It's called metastasization as the cancer can spread out. So, our lymphatic system has to have little regular checkpoints to screen and watch for pathogens, to watch for invaders. So, let's take a look at the lymphatic system and sort of get to know it a little bit. We're going to zoom in on it here.
The lymphatic system is a network of
Turn the audio off. All right. So, when you look at the lymphatic system, what you have are lymphatic nodules. And I'll just pause there. It's a good spot. Now, these nodules you could think of as little screens, and the lymphatic system, as it's returning fluid, they are literally blood vessels with little nodules along the way that basically act as screens, but we'll get into that in some detail. These nodules, you know quite well. If you've ever had a sore throat and you've felt the base of the neck, there's a few here, and they'll become inflamed as they're fighting pathogens. You've your tonsils at the back of your throat right here. If you go to the doctor and say um, with the tongue depressor, you can see these, and sometimes these get infected. And this lymphatic organ is meant to screen for pathogens that you breathe in. It's sort of the first line of defense. Our bodies want to be aware of the pathogens and also responding to them. You've got another set of tonsils here. These are called the sublingual. They're a little bit further down at the base of the tongue. Their role is the same. And then you've got nasal pharyngeal tonsils. And I remember this being a big issue for my brother. These, when they become inflamed, are called adenoids. And at some point, if these become too much of an issue, if they become too infected, recurring infection, they can be removed. Another reason that's been mentioned to remove them is their inflammation blocks the airways and can contribute to snoring or to sleep apnea. In some cases, they will remove them. So our tonsils here and nasopharyngeal here are quite important sort of frontline watchers for infection. Right here, this is your thymus. Now, around sort of our later teenage years, we don't need this so much anymore. This is where a certain class of white blood cell known as T cells goes to school. It's where it gets an education. And T cells are very important, and I talk about them in a separate lecture, but this is where they develop. Now, many a time when we've done dissections through Biology 11 and Biology 12, you've seen a sort of a little red sort of crescent-shaped organ, and it's been very close to the stomach, sort of adjacent. And students ask all the time, well, what is that thing? What is it? Well, what that structure is that's your spleen. And that's another lymphatic organ whose role is to cleanse the blood, get rid of old blood cells. It moderates blood pressure a little bit because it removes, think of it as old content. Um, but it's number one sort of stock answer for what the spleen does is it filters blood. And yes, some of the white blood cells do get an education here. Just going to move ahead a little bit. And this is a really important point in the lesson. When we look at the capillary exchange, when you go from um, arterioles and then you start moving into the capillaries here, is something you have to stop to consider. First, we know that this is extremely thin. And it's thin because there needs to be a flow of nutrients out of the bloodstream. It needs to go to the tissues, whether or not those tissues are muscle, whether they're nervous, whether they're cardiac, whatever they are. there needs to be an exchange of oxygen. We need the amino acids and the sugars, carbohydrates, fats, etc. Those need to flow out. And then the waste products from the tissues need to flow in. And those waste products, of course, include carbon dioxide and other metabolic wastes. So when we look at the system, what I want to point out is that arterioles are under a lot more pressure. And with that pressure, there's sort of a net osmotic push out. And this push here is very, very high. Now, I'll go on to explain this in a minute. The push to as you go through the capillary system starts out high, and then it becomes sort of fades as you go through the capillary and you come back to the venule on the other side. And that makes an opportunity for some things to flow back in. Okay, so what kind of things? All right, let's take a look. You want really high pressure leading from the arteriole because that helps to push water out, which all our tissues need, and our nutrients. And we see, oxygen, amino acids, glucose, triglycerides, etc. Now, the pressure on the arterial side is a little hard to read here, so I'll just state it. It's 40 millimeters equivalents of mercury. Now, there is, of course, pressure from the tissues pushing backwards, and it's about 25 millimeters. So that's the natural sort of standing, sort of watery pressure out here. Well, the good news is that the push out on the front end is about 15 millimeters higher, which is why all this good stuff flows out. Now, on the tail side here, as we're heading towards the venule, what you'll see is the pressure, the sort of standing pressure, is still 25 millimeters of mercury equivalents, but the pressure inside of the blood vessel here, as we're starting to head towards the venule, we're on the far side of the capillary, and the pressure has reduced. We've lost quite a few things. So the pressure inside goes downwards of about 10 millimeters of pressure standing inside the pipe. Well, if it's 25 outside, but only 10 on the inside, the net difference is that there's 15 millimeters of osmotic pressure in, which is kind of hard to resist. So things will flow back in at this portion in the capillary bed. And yes, you'll get water. You also get carbon dioxide will enter, and other waste molecules such as urea, etc., creatinine, to flow back into the venule. And of course, you should be thinking about the kidney now. Let's get into general circulation. Of course, general circulation will lead to the kidneys for purification of these things. Now, carbon dioxide, I shouldn't really indicate that it's going to be purified at the kidneys. Carbon dioxide will reach the lungs, and that's a whole different lesson where we talk about its exchange. But what I really want to point out here is that some carbon dioxide will hitch a ride on those red blood cells, but what you probably didn't know is that a lot of that carbon dioxide will become aqueous, and it will become something similar to bicarbonate ions. So yeah, you heard it here. Your carbon dioxide hitches a ride back through the bloodstream to your lungs as sort of like hydrogen carbonate or bicarbonate ions. And if you've ever a little bit of chemistry, that's sort of like a base. That's baking soda like, just sort of a liquid form. But I promise we'll get to that in the respiratory system. So if we look back at this again, we get an outflow of nutrients here and an inflow of waste products here. Now there's a reason why I wanted to look at this image, and that's because with the pressure difference, there's still a lot of fluid in the sort of in between the capillary beds, and that's what we call interstitial fluid. And that's what this green structure here, this lymphatic system, is designed to do. It picks up the excess of water, and the waste products that enter here, we basically call this lymphatic fluid, and that is a way of draining excess fluid in the tissues. Now, it's pretty important to do this because if you don't drain excessive fluid in the tissues, you may remember this from Biology 11. There's a tropical parasite called the filarial worm, And if you're bitten by a mosquito, it can introduce this worm into basically into the blood, and it makes its way into your lymphatic tissues. Now, the reason I'm showing this picture is if the lymphatic vessels don't do their work, the tissues can't drain of fluid. So this is an extreme example. Um, Filariasis is this little worm here, basically, that bites you, and the adult worm gets into your lymphatic system and plugs the lymphatic ducts. What does that look like? Well, the lymphatic ducts, um, courtesy of this diagram is quite good. Just want to give a sort of a little shout out here to Marissa. This is her graphic, but it's really neat the way this has been shown. It's one of the few diagrams that I actually saw this with. If the filarial worm is introduced here, it's basically you're bitten. The worm can make its way into the capillaries, and of course, there's the lymphatic vessels right there. And if they're infected, the filarial worms can get in here, and there will be an immune response to the worms. And that immune response can kill the worms, and they can occlude or plug up these vessels. And what you get is an inability of the lymphatic system to drain fluid from tissues. And the tissues begin to fill up with what we call edema, or just think of it as lymph that didn't get into these tissues. And what's worse is the lymphatic nodes themselves can get plugged as we get filarial worms in there too. So it's not good. The only way really to avoid this kind of infection is to not get bitten by the mosquito in the first place, or to have pest control. Sleeping under nets is another way. You just don't want to get bitten, period. So that is a disease of your lymphatic system known as filariasis. Its more sort of general term is elephantiasis, because it makes the limbs sort of have an elephant-like limb appearance. Okay. Now, in this animation, what I want to point out is how the lymphatic system works. So, as excessive tissue fluid is picked up by the lymphatic capillaries, sort of like these fine little netted capillaries here, there's an influx, and what you're getting here is really the creation of lymph. So here's all the major nodes, and you can see how many there are on the neck, and lots under the armpit. In females, more lymphatic tissue in the breast tissue than in males. And as the lymphatic, this is called an afferent or entering lymphatic. Well, I just have to hit reset there. And I just want to pause it at a certain point here. If the As I'm waiting for the animation to reset, if the worms work their way into this, you could see how this could become plugged and how this process just wouldn't happen. So you would get incredible tissue edema. So that's not a bad idea to have to go back. So the nodes and the vessels, as we say. There's your spleen there. I'm just going to pause this. Now, the entering vessels are called afferent vessels, and the exiting, this one that's exiting from the node, is known as an efferent. Now, we saw that in the kidney where we talked about afferent and efferent, sort of entering and leaving. And that's what you're looking at here. The outside of a lymphatic node is called the cortex, and inside is the medulla. As the lymphatic tissue goes through here, I referred to this as a screen, and that's why. Because as it works its way sort of through this network, this gives the immune system a chance to respond if there's anything if there's any infective agents in there. And this will swell if basically in a response where it's generally it'll swell, it'll become a little bit more leaky, and that allows the tissue to sort of spread out a little bit, and the white blood cells can get in there and fight the infection even more. That's really the purpose of swelling. So lymphatic tissue, or the lymphatic fluid, flows out this side once it's being screened. And you've got major lymphatic ducts right here. Now, a lot of the lymph fluid, this is the major returning site for clean lymph. It gets put back in here into the thoracic ducts, and then it goes back into the circulatory system, cleansed preferably, which is the whole point of going through all these little nodes. Your thymus is really active when you're young, and I'll tell you why. Because when you're young, your immune system hasn't had as much of an education, so the T cells really need to fight the battle. They're very important warriors in the battle against infection. So your thymus works overtime when you're younger. Of course, your tonsils are catching infections that are coming in through the nasal pharyngeal region. That's a major area or entrance to things. Think of pneumonia, for example, right? Airborne pathogens. Okay, and that's really all I wanted to show with that. It's a good little animation there. Okay. So the lymphatic system, here you go. Now when we introduce the lymphatic capillaries, you get this sort of idea of how the overall system works. Think of it as fluid interception, because that's what it is. The black area is just interstitial fluid. And all these little lymphatic capillaries here lead back into the major lymphatic ducts. Let's just pause for a moment and get out of there. There's a few note items that I do want you to be aware of. So, just have to synchronize my, there we go, iPad here. Okay, so this is the material that you would have, there's my note shelf. There we are. So here's the basics, of course, searching for infections and returning excessive fluid. And here they've shown the lymphatic nodules and the major organs. So you do have to know about the thymus and the spleen, and of course the tonsils. Okay, don't forget those. Just make a note of sort of these basics here. And this is a good sort of visualization. It's interesting. It's spelling lymph, L-I-M-P-H. I've always spelled it L-Y-M-P-H. But there's all the tissues there, and they're returning all the fluid. And it's pretty important. Later on, when we look at the digestive system, there are some lymphatic vessels actually in your small intestine. And they take up these little things called villi. It's an interesting topic. So it's important to have lymphatic vessels in the digestive system too. They do a great job of absorbing, in particular, they're very good at absorbing fat. And these are what they look like. If you've ever watched the Magic School Bus, you've seen Miss Frizzle was talking about those rubber cactus-like things that absorb nutrients in our digestive system. And those are little lymphatic, sort of a little finger of sort of little lymphatic tissue that we call lacteals. And it's found in the digestive system. Now, specifically, we'll come back to this. There we go. Just have to get my, better not use green. I don't think that'll work. There we go. This is found in your small intestine, sort of in the mucus layer. They're known as villi. But we'll just plant the seed for now and we'll come back to it. So the lymphatic system is really, it's like a collection system. Now, if you remember, we look back to the circulatory system, your arterial system is very muscular with lots of sort of powerful elastic tissue, and it is muscular enough to keep the blood flowing basically in one direction. Now remember that veins lead back to the heart and arteries lead away. So as it's leading away, arteries are kind of pulsing, and you don't have to put valves in them. They're very good at keeping the blood flow going. But if you recall, veins weren't, and they had to have these little one-way valves. Well, it turns out lymphatic vessels are wimpy and pathetic too, so they have to have valves exactly like veins did, because they just can't get the job done. In fact, lymphatic vessels are very, very thin. they'll lead back towards what we call lymphatic trunks, or trunks, or larger sort of areas for lymphatic tissue to flow. But you have to put in valves because you don't want lymph going back into the tissue. The whole point is to get it out. So it's now you see that sort of third part of the circulatory system that you weren't considering. You knew about the arterial and the venous system, but along comes the lymphatic system, and you have to think about its importance, fighting infection, and of course, returning lymphatic fluid, the fluid that needs to go back to the blood for, well, processing. I always like to think of the kidneys there. And just an overview, if you were in medical school, you'd have to know a lot about the lymphatic system, but you can see what we've been referring to, sort of the spot areas. There's lots of lymphatic tissue in the groin, in the armpit, in the neck, in the nasal pharyngeal region, right? And in breast tissue as well. And elephantiasis, you can see the one limb is more an advanced stage, the left leg there. The ducts have been plugged longer, and if you don't return the fluid, you end up with this sort of excessive edema, this tissue swelling. And there's not really a way to go back. Those little filarial worms have plugged the lymphatic vessels, and you can't get them out. So you don't want to get infected in the first place. This is a big problem in countries where the mosquitoes become infected. Now, the mosquito's been infected because the blood it's consuming is infected. This is very similar to malaria. So it's really what you have to do is you have to get rid of the mosquito, or you have to prevent the infection in the first place. And then if the mosquitoes can't get infected, they can't bite anybody that's infected. But you can see it's a massive problem. Really good shot here of the lymphatic capillaries doing the job of getting into the capillary network, into the exchange system, and doing the intercepting. So I really like this one. They refer to the lymphatic vessels here as being blind, and I'll tell you what they mean. They mean that the ends are sort of rounded like this. So the fluids will flow in sort of through these regular junctions under pressure, and they can't flow backwards. It's just sort of like a one-way system here. And the valves, of course, help out in the direction of the flow of lymph. This is a good shot because it shows it off quite well, where you have quite a few lymph nodes. And of course, these regions themselves will become quite enlarged if you have sort of large infections. When the bubonic plague struck in the Middle Ages, there were little bumps, and they would get found in the groin in particular. They were called buboes, and that was infected lymphatic tissue with the little the germ that it was a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, and it would the lymphatic nodes were doing everything they could, throwing everything but the kitchen sink at it. It's an easy thing to kill with antibiotics these days, at least it is right now, but it was a major problem back then. So the removal of microorganisms and even cellular debris, there's sort of a screen here. It's really important not only to remove things, but to be on guard and activate the immune system, the filtering and getting rid of germs and things like that. You kind of have to do all these things. That's what your lymphatic tissue is really all about. There's just another simple kind of shot here, profiling the tonsils, the thymus, spleen down here. And remember I said it's just off the side of the stomach? It's interesting. And you look in fish, it's off the side of the stomach. You look at the reptiles, the birds, the amphibians, it's always near the stomach. So it's interesting. That's some common comparative anatomy. And there's a few, oh, I didn't mention, there's a few little, um, these are called Peyer's patches down here. And there's some lymphatic, they're just foci for lymphatic tissue around your digestive system. Just in case, if you think about our digestive system, we're introducing food basically very close to our bloodstream. So it's a good idea to have a little bit of backup down there, watching for microorganisms or things you might have consumed that turns out to be an issue. Okay, so just a few uh, informational items. The tonsils are catching a lot of sort of the airborne pathogens that we could be encountering. So that's good, making our immune system aware of what's been coming in through the air. The spleen is a really large lymphoid organ, of course, located near the stomach, cleaning the blood, watching out for bacteria, recycling blood cells, and of course, it's watching for infection. Um, Lymphatic cells here, of course, if they encounter if they encounter cells that are a concern, pathogens, or even cancer cells, they can alert the immune system. It's good. It's all sort of like a large immune system sort of army. And the tonsils back here, one of the things we do in class, or if you ever get a chance, you go check it out on YouTube. You can see the tonsils back here. And of course, if they're removed, you can see why that increases the airflow. These ones here. And there's your uvula. So when you say, when the doctor sticks the tongue depressor in your mouth and gets you to say, these things stick up, and it gives them a chance to look at them. And what you have here right now is a set of tonsils that aren't infected. But if they were, there would be slippery, sort of slimy mucus on them. They would have little white spots. I remember when I had an infected left tonsil. I actually looked at it myself, and it was one of the shorter visits to the doctor I've ever had. I walked in and said, doctor said, "Well, why do you think you're here? What are you here for, Mr. Bleecker?" And I said, "I think I've got an infected tonsil." "How do you know?" "Well, I took a look. There's some white spots on my tonsil." "Let's see." "Yep, you have an infected tonsil." And here's the prescription. It was one of the shorter ones ever. But when things get infected or inflamed, we say what that is. We say that's an inflammation of. So that's a way of saying inflammation, sort of in the medical community, is to say itis, like arthritis. In fact, inflammation of the joints. If the tonsils become inflamed, we say that's tonsillitis. So you sort of get the idea here. Your nasal pharyngeal tonsils, the ones that are just sort of at the back of the throat, but you have to go up a little bit. You can actually see them if you pushed your nose straight up and looked up there with a light. If they're infected, that's when you've got adenoids. And you think about it, these things used to be whacked out all the time. My mother would tell stories of when she had her palatine tonsils, the ones at the back of her throat. Now, there's sublingual tonsils down at the base of your tongue, but these palatine tonsils, the one at the back of your sort of just adjacent to your uvula here, they used to whack these out all the time because they were getting infected in children. But they really do have a purpose, which is the reason why they leave them in. Now, if you're a chronic snorer, that's different. They might want to remove them just to make more airflow here. Or if you've got apnea, a problem with airflow, they might whack them out, and they might even cut the uvula there, which would look really strange when you go to say and there's just no dangly in the back of your throat. Odd. Could look very odd. Again, there's your spleen, and just a neat little shot here of how it's very near the stomach. Okay, and sort of sorry folks, ad nauseum, but it's all about cleansing the blood. It gets rid of old blood cells. So does your liver. Spleen's just doing a lot of this, and of course keeping an eye out for infection. So I don't want to spend too much time on the spleen, but apparently it's well loved in my presentation. I went overboard. Oh well, not the first time. Thymus gland. Now, you might have heard of T cells, and what those are is those are T lymphocytes, some of the best fighters. And I really don't want to give away too much because I want to talk about them when I talk about blood. But the thymus is a great place for them to go and mature. It's sort of like school for these specific lymphocytes. And as our immune system, as we get older and our immune system has fought, so many different battles, we don't need it anymore. It's located right here, kind of along the trachea. Okay. And we just don't need it. It atrophies. And you guys are about 17 in my grade 12 class. So your thymus is withering too. That's okay. It's old age. Little point about our really about our immune white blood cells, where a lot of our cells are coming from. Our red blood cells and white blood cells come from cells that originate stem cells. You've heard about these, and it's your red bone marrow where they're actually being made. So don't think that they're being produced in the lymphatic tissue. That's just a place where they go to fight wars, and they sort of take up positions and they get an education. At that point they can mature and learn things, but really their origin is in the red bone marrow. Now we're talking about spongy bone marrow, but of course a lot more to talk about on that topic later. And there's a good shot of your thymus. Some people get this really confused with your thyroid gland. Now your thyroid gland is right here, is above, right there. And your thyroid gland is not your thymus, okay? Your thyroid gland has a lot more to do with your metabolism. It's more of an endocrine organ or a hormone maker. Your thymus is down here, right? A little closer towards your lungs. It's still on your trachea, but we're talking about this one down here, this sort of lumpy thing here, okay? Over here it's shown like that. So it is more posterior to the thyroid. Thyroid's higher. Let's keep it that way. Keep it simple. And of course, it's a neat point. It's not that your thymus fights infection. It's not a lymphatic nodule. That's not its role per se. Its role is for T lymphocytes to mature, to become more aware. It's not something that's directly involved in the fight. I know that's an interesting distinction to make. Well, I thought I had one or two more slides for that, but I don't. Okay, so I'm going to turn off AirPlay there. And really, just a little bit more here. Just going to turn the text off. And just pointing out that your lymphatic ducts, you've got regions of your body where drainage is sort of focused. So this lymphatic duct here on the right side focused on that region. And this lymphatic duct, really kind of the left side, has quite a job to do. There's a lot of drainage. It's got more of a focal area. And I think just a shot at lymphatic nodules. But I think we've accomplished what we want to accomplish for this lesson. If you like this kind of stuff, there's so much more you can go into detail. If you go into pre-med, you'll study this in depth. If you go into kinesiology, of course, you'll study human anatomy much more. And if you're thinking about going in the medical field, I highly invite you to do so. It's fascinating. And I want to thank you guys for popping by again. And that's it for the lymphatic system. I hope that was a little bit more short and sweet, but there's quite a tale to be told here too. So thanks. Have a good one.